Broadcasting live from the salon, this is The Monstrous Feminine, a podcast where horrible humans talk about horror. My name's Tyia, and I'm joined by my voodoo dolls,
Louisa
and Zeba.
And unfortunately, Mila can't join us for this episode due to technical difficulties. If you would like to hear one extra bonus episode consisting of an interview we did with a writer, producer, and hoodoo practitioner, Ariadne Knight, then head over to our Patreon and pledge to hear extra episodes. Go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcast app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
In Season 3 of American Horror Story, a coven of witches descended from Salem move into a school for witches in New Orleans and have to fight for survival in a world of witch hunters and persecution. The coven are particularly vulnerable at this time because they are facing a natural change in leadership when one supreme matures and comes into her power, and the old one weakens and dies to allow the coven to continue. However, the current leading supreme, Fiona Good, refuses to give up her crown and threatens any young witch she believes to be the next supreme. Matters are made even more complicated by the long-standing feud between the witches and the black voodoo practitioners across town, led by powerful voodoo priestess Marie Laveau.
I mean, after all, your kind and my kind have been going after each other for centuries. Though it is kind of like a hammer going after a nail.
Everything you got from us.
Tituba, voodoo slave girl who graced us with her black magic. She couldn't tell a love potion from a recipe for chocolate chip cookies if she had to read it.
I wanted to talk about how when we were first launching the pod, each of us posted what our favorite mon femme was on the Instagram, and your favorite mon femme, Zeba, was Marie Laveau. So I wanted to know why she's your favorite mon femme.
I mean, I think mostly it's just Angela Bassett. I cannot say she would be my favorite if she was played by anybody else, but I just think that, you know, unfortunately, as the seasons go on, she did not have the role that I would want her to have in the larger cinematic universe that is American Horror Story. But I think as far as her position in that universe, I think she's very unique and very powerful in a way that we don't really see amongst like other mon femmes. Like, I think she, like, I just love that her power is so long standing. Like, she has been there for ever. I just love how her age, she's just like a sort of like an unshakable presence in New Orleans, and she's not some sort of like weird old hag in the woods who you go to for like dark favors. Everybody knows who she is. She's out, she's open in the public. She owns her hair salon, and I think it's just like a very fun modernization of the monstrous feminine in a way that I think, I mean, listen, we gonna get into it because it do miss. It misses in the way that just like media's depictions of voodoo miss. I can accept that. But I can accept that because I think if I were to list the other people who would be my favorite, I would run into similar issues. That's right. Just that, you know, we just don't get total control of those narratives and how they splay out and how accurate things are.
I also wanted to know, my second follow-up catch-up point was, if you could have any one of like the witchy powers, like which one would you want? So there's clairvoyance, resurrection, human voodoo doll, psychism, pyrokinesis, killing boys through sex, mind control via spit in a cup, divination, transmutation, and then like where you go to hell and like come back. I don't even understand particularly what that is, except for guessing the number of objects or guessing where shit was. I
mean, divination also includes like all forms of future telling, so like tarot, bone reading, all that kind of thing. Like it's not as clear as like Alice in Twilight, where she just like has visions, or like That's So Raven. I always interpreted divination as like using tools, magical tools, to ask questions and get answers.
I think mine would probably be resurrection. I think that would be interesting. Like resurrection / healing. I would want Misty's powers.
I don't know if I could handle the responsibility of resurrection, because I feel like I'd be playing God. I know that's a really religious phrase for me to use, but like I don't know how else to, like I just don't think I would be I don't feel like I could handle that power. But I would really like, I've always liked the idea of like mind reading or like clairvoyance or something like that.
I feel like I would hurt my own feelings too much. Like maybe I would use it in the wrong
Like, do you have a crush on me? And they'd be like, she's literally the ugliest person I've ever seen in my life. And then I'll be like, oh my God.
Or be like, am I getting a promotion this week? And then
She's
getting
getting fired.
Absolutely not, you're getting fired. And some things I'd rather find out spontaneously. Or like maybe you'll be like, I think my husband's planning a surprise. You'll be like, no, babes, he's cheating on you. He's serving you the divorce papers. Like, no, too many instances where I could hurt my own feelings.
If we're being real, though, the most iconic power of this season was the killer pussy, and the most mon femme power of them all.
The Monstrous Feminine is on TikTok, so go leave us a comment. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week is Worm Craps Good, who commented on our It TikTok and said, Mary Poppins is the same species as It, just feeds on happiness instead of fear.
I'm gonna be honest, I haven't seen Mary Poppins since I was like 6, so I really couldn't tell you what that movie is about in detail.
I mean, does she have an origin story? She could very well be from space. I don't know.
You guys should always comment on our stuff with your own theories because we like to hear them.
We want to hear them. We might discuss them on our episodes for sure.
Friendly reminder, we are also on Patreon. For £1 a month, you gain access to our Discord. For £3 a month, you get to hear a cut discussion from our main episodes. And for £5, you get all that, plus a bonus episode. So please support us. Any contribution helps. What do you guys think of the general representation of voodooism in this series? Obviously, this series covers many a thing, but to narrow it down, we are gonna go at this mostly with this voodoo lens.
Yeah, honestly, I'm gonna be 100% and say I feel as though I do not know enough about voodoo to take offense or say what is right or wrong about the representation of it on the show. I would definitely be grasping for straws because I truly don't know. What I did like about the way that it went about witchcraft and voodoo on the show was addressing similarities, I would say, and also talking about the way that many of the practices or things that people consider witchcraft have destigmatized because it is associated with white women and white witchcraft did originate from voodoo, and also talking about Tyia and just the origin of witchcraft in general. I did like.
See, that was actually the point that I wasn't sure about. In the lore where we're talking about Salem, and that is where we're originating from, we don't go further back than that, that the white witches learned magic from Tyia, who, if folks listening don't know, was a real black slave woman accused of being a witch in Salem, along with the other white witches. But in American Horror Story lore, we're meant to believe that she taught the white women how to do all this witchcraft, and that what they're doing is actually not different, and that it doesn't come from different lines. That's where I was sort of confused, because that implies that white people were not doing magic before Salem, which I think sort of kind of goes against their own lore of how old their system is and how the Supremes work. It's implied that there was magic before Salem. It's just Salem was an incident related to magic, or maybe that they learned more magic in Salem from Tyia. That was what was murky to me. And I don't know if I believing that they're practicing the same type of magic. That voodoo and white magic, air quotes, as it is practiced by the white witches, and also, I guess, Queenie we can get to. I just don't necessarily believe that what they're doing is the same practice, because, the white witches have a very specific system, and like you said, there's this, the powers they have to go through, there's a way of becoming a supreme, they have all sorts of, tests and rituals and leagues of powers that they can or cannot get, and the rules seem very different from the rules of voodoo as they're presented in this world. So that's where I was everything got muddled.
Honestly, my interpretation of it was more of the way that things have been co-opted in a public sphere, because I think there's so much more stigma around voodoo than there is around witchcraft. But in actuality,
do you think so in this series as well?
I mean, even in this series, to be honest.
I guess because I'm thinking of the witch hunter character, but the witch hunter character does kill literally every black person in that salon, so I guess they do get punished. But it wasn't he was organized.
Queenie, when she was living in the Coven, her powers weren't taken very seriously at all. To the point where, I think it's Mary Laveau, That's Angela Bassett, right? She ends up taking Queenie in, being like, yeah, like these white witches are really not paying attention to you. They're not helping you reach your potential. And she has to take her under her wing because they pretty much just kind of brush off her power because they don't understand it until it's like useful for them to learn about voodoo. I definitely agree with you that like they aren't practicing the same thing just because there's so much other cultural aspects and spiritual aspects of voodoo than what they're doing.
We only get like little bits and pieces of even what they're doing. Like there's montages of Angela Bassett like sacrificing an animal like the snake or a chicken or something. Like it's very like vague what she has to do to get her to her desired goal, like to resurrect the zombies or to, I guess it's almost like possession. She like controls people's bodies. Like the things that she is able to do is completely different from what the white witches are even able to do. I think
because like in modern day, it feels like a lot of things have been like muddled together. There are definitely people who are like purely do voodoo or hoodoo, but I feel like from what I've seen on like social media and the way that people talk about stuff, there's a lot of between people who will co-opt things from other forms of magic or witchcraft into like one thing. And I don't know the rules. I don't know the rules. So I can't say, but I've seen like people talk about like the older origins of things in terms of there were witch trials in Europe as well. That's where the Maleficus Malicurum, or I think that's what it's called, but like the Hammer of Witches was like written in Germany. So there's definitely been talk of witchcraft before the Salem witch trials. But yeah, thinking like the modern case of like people kind of muddle everything together and it starts to be really unclear of where the origins of things came from. So I think they aren't practicing the same thing, and those things didn't necessarily come from each other. But then again, I don't know.
I will say something that I think they did get not right, but different than the other media representations is that all the voodoo magic has to do with like deals and exchanges. So like you go to a deity, in this case, I don't know who they were saying it was actually in this case, because it looks like it could be many different Yoruba deities, but whatever. They go to him and it's like you exchange your soul for something, or you promise that every year you're going to do a sacrifice for them, or you promise that you're going to like forever be in their control or in their debt or in their favor for the power that you're receiving.
I want to talk about like the representation / treatment of Black people in this series. I was reading a good essay by Amanda K. LeBlanc called "There's Nothing I Hate More Than a Racist," in quotes, recentering whiteness in American Horror Story Coven. And this essay was basically, essentially just pointing out like the kind of problematic use of Black people. The first point that LeBlanc raises is like the violence. Obviously, as I mentioned, like everyone in the salon like dies brutally, and like they don't come back. Like the white witches do have violence against them, but they ended up like coming back and whatnot and the other. And so I quote, LeBlanc says that the Coven disproportionately relies on violence against Black bodies in order to provide horror to the audience. The show focuses on the gruesomeness of dismemberment and murder while ignoring the white politics behind those acts. And it disproportionately also presents Black bodies as victims of violence. And then she kind of adds later on, much of the horror in Coven depends on graphic violence against Black people as a storytelling device. Like white characters too are victims of violence, but they are killed or maimed individually, and we get to know their backstory. Whereas the horrific dismemberment of all the Black men, the slaves in Coven, serves no other narrative purpose than to construct La Laurie's character as an outdated racist. White characters and motivations drive the story here, and Blackness is the collateral damage.
I definitely agree with some of the points that you said in that piece. The only thing I think we should probably note is that there was a horrific gang rape scene on like the first episode, which honestly to me was probably one of the worst rape scenes I've ever seen on a television show, and I thought it was really unnecessary. I think the series in general was a bit muddled about it being like so female centered, but also having so much graphic violence against women.
I did have a note later on about like in general, like there's excessive sexual assault. And I mentioned Madison's gang rape and also Kyle's incestuous abuse. So it's not even just women, but like there's just a lot of things that I just felt like why do we have that? And I'll get to it in just a second. But the second point in this essay by LeBlanc was about stereotypes, and they talk about Patricia Hill Collins's Black feminist thought text, where she's basically talking about like stereotypes against Black people, and the fact that black men, and I quote, are presented as like animals with uncontrollable sexual desires are a long-standing stereotype that works to dehumanize bodies of color as uncivilized or brutish. And she argues that this film does it by literally turning him into a beast, Marie Laveau's lover. And then also she comments on Queenie's portrayal as a sexual woman aligns with Bell Hooks' assertion, and then she's quoting Bell Hooks, which is that the black body gains attention only when it is synonymous with accessibility, availability, when it is sexually deviant. Which kind of goes back to, the use of sex in this is also very horrifically violent and weird. Like, that whole Minotaur scene with Queenie was very odd, very uncomfortable, seemed really out of place. I don't know why all of a sudden she was, like, touching herself and, like, acting like that. Like, we'd had no insight into her, like, sexuality before then, and we don't even have it after. And it's like, I don't know if it's implied that he like attacked her or like assaulted her. It's like really ambiguous. And so I agree that like in general, I think this series uses sex in a very odd manner across like racial divides there. But yeah,
I think the issue comes up, and this is like across horror as a genre, and we come across this all the time, but specifically like in American Horror Story, is like sex is present throughout all the seasons as like a site for horror. But the issue is that like in a story that involves race or that has characters that aren't white, it's just gonna land different. So the Minotaur is actually like a very similar thematic device or character as like the Rubber Man from season 1. It's just this like blank behind the eyes figure of sex and aggression and violation. It's essentially the same character. The difference is that white people do not have a history of like being dehumanized in the same way or of sexual violence that happens in the same way. So it just comes off wrong, right? It's not different from the ways that the show uses sex, and especially like anonymity in sex or dehumanization in sex, which is a theme throughout horror, but it's one of those shows that, as we know, is unafraid to reference or not reference. So like the horror genre at large, it's going to have the same problems of when you incorporate race into traditional horror tropes. You got to be like really careful or it goes like off the rails mad fast.
There was a lot of muddled themes of like sex and abuse in this. Madison and Kyle, none of that was consensual. He was not even able to talk for like 90% of the show, so...
But like, imagine if he had been a black character. Absolutely unacceptable. Like, that is where, like, it goes from, like, wrong and taboo to, like, 100%. Why did you do that?
There are a lot of things in the show. Like, honestly, this is probably my favorite season of American Horror Story because it kind of went off the rails after this one. Like, Hotel also had the same weird sex issues where it was linking sex and horror, but in a way that was just like, I didn't want to see it on TV. That chainsaw anal scene, it still haunts my memory. In this one, I felt like a lot of it didn't actually need to be there to tell the story of either of them. Madison could have killed all the frat boys on the bus a completely different way without them having a violent gang rape of her. There was certainly another way that they could have made her angry enough.
Yeah, she was a very volatile person. Like, in general. Like, it could have been as simple as they insulted her ego and she probably would have killed them. Like, why did we need that?
I didn't think that was necessary, especially, like, showing so much of it. It was incredibly triggering and horrific to show on TV. Then the continued thing of what was essentially assault on Kyle with Madison, and she just wanted like a toy. Gross. The thing with Queenie and the Centaur, yes, also gross. Just so many question marks where I was just like, I don't know why this was needed narratively. I didn't actually remember a lot of this because the first time I saw it, there's just so many iconic moments of the show where there's one-liners and stuff where you won't necessarily pick it up on a first watch. But seeing this again for, like, honestly at this point, I think like the third or fourth time, I was like, and looking for things to talk about on the pod, made me see a lot of different things that I didn't see before in the show, where I was just like, oh my gosh, this was not needed narratively. Also, Jessica Lange's character, Fiona, and Mary Laveau's character, their alliance together almost felt a bit more like mamming, because she did have to show Fiona how to use her powers and take care of her and watch her die and build this friendship that almost felt like Green Room. Not Green Room. I like the movie Green Room. Green Book. That's what I'm looking for.
Green Book. The way that they meet is so interesting too, because she like shows up at the salon and she's like visibly uncomfortable. Fiona is like, she makes some comment like, oh no, she like pulls her hair too tight. She's like, whatever, she's tender-headed and she pulls on her hair too tight. She's like, oh, you're not used to doing like white people's hair in this part of town, are you? And they're like, oh, we're not used to white people in this part of town, point blank, like at all. And then like everyone's laughing at her. They're like, it reminds me of that scene in Hairspray where it's like very similar, unafraid to reference or not reasons, where Amber's mom is like going to the black part of town to like pick up her daughter. This is from the original, but I think it happens in the remake too. Like pick up her daughter at the record store. It's like always like a record store, a hair salon, you know, people where black people hang out. And they like go there and they have this like weird exchange where they like have to verbalize like what is uncomfortable about like a white person in a black space. And then she's like, she makes a comment to Angela Bassett basically about like, oh, how do you look so young? Like, I know you're old as dirt, bitch. Like, we all are, us witches. We're like what's your secret? Because like we know what she's been doing to like stay young, which is to remain supreme and to like suck the power from the young people. We know what she's doing, but she doesn't know how Angela Bassett has managed to not age this whole time, and that is how their alliance forms. It's through like the weird, shallow, petty goals of Fiona. Like, it never made sense to me. I'm like, Fiona, all you want is to stay young? Like, what a weird motivation for all this. But to me, it like trivializes their alliance. You know what I mean? Like Fiona's motivations are so shallow, and Marie Laveau's are like so deeply rooted in something else. Like the reason she uses her magic is so different and not self-serving in the way that Fiona's is, in the way that like I do not get how they got to be besties.
It didn't really make sense, but it's just fun for the audience to see two iconic, powerful actresses teamed up on screen. I love Angela Bassett and I love Jessica Lange, so like seeing them together on TV, it took me out of it. And then seeing it again, I was like, how? And then there's also the factor of like Kathy Bates' character, who Delphine Lalaurie, her character, who's a fiery racist, disgusting, horrible trash, somehow starts to get factored into the Coven in a redemption arc way, as like, now that I'm around the Negroes, they not so bad. And I was like, this is weird. Especially the fact that they kind of like start making it where Marie and her start having like a banterous, fun friendship. And I'm like, this is enough. But like with everyone in the Coven in general, they just kind of like start enjoying her company, almost as like they go from hating her to being like, oh yeah, this is like
pet
our
racist, yeah,
our
like
resident racist,
our friendly neighborhood racist.
And they go from like avidly hating her and doing things that would mean to being like, oh yeah, it's fine, like she's here, like that's part of the family. And I'm like, what? Especially because regardless of if she has some realization of her actions were wrong, the stuff that she did was so horrific that there was no redemption arc. There should have been no forgiveness or anything like that, but it just doesn't come up at all. Like it was just weird. Like her character didn't even need to be there.
That was another point that LeBlanc discussed in their essay, and it was about colorblindness in American Horror Story, and the fact that a lot of violence against Black people without actually interrogating racial politics. Essentially, LeBlanc argues that this is like Delphine Lalaurie. They situate like the racism with her, and therefore in the past, and ignore how these politics are playing out in the present day, especially within the feud between Fiona and Marie Laveau, because the fact that they have like beef on sight is obviously racially motivated, but it goes without saying. And then Fiona is like an obviously like racist or prejudiced character. She frees her in the first place from her purgatory that like Marie Laveau had like buried her to suffer for the rest of eternity. She gets her out, so obviously she's already like showing kindness to somebody who didn't deserve it. And then she pairs her with Queenie, thinking that would not be like a destructive thing to do, or like torture for Queenie, like subjects her to that, and it's meant to be like punishment and, like you said, like comedic relief, like haha, when actually it's like, what are we doing? Like why are we doing this? But then alongside that, there's like this weird, almost like in Get Out, where it's like, I would have voted for Obama a third time if I could. Liberal politics that happen here with Fiona, because she says like, she literally says she voted for Obama. I don't know why voting for Obama is like the benchmark of like progress here if you're a white person. But anyway, she says that she voted for Obama. She says that like we have a lot of like Black people in like power now to Lalaurie. And then Fiona says like, you've got a lot to learn. And then she says, which is the title of LeBlanc's essay, There's Nothing I Hate More Than a Racist. And it's like, it's so weird that she's saying that, because actually she is like quite a racist character herself. It's just not spoken about. And I think that that was a really poignant point in this essay about like the color blindness of this season and how like the racial politics are really weird.
Well, they had to have LaLaurie so no one else appeared to be racist, because like she had to be so extreme that everyone else was just like neutral.
We've said on like every episode where there was race horror, we've said they make it so extreme that nothing else meets the benchmark. Like everything else just seems mild in comparison because it's not that forthright. And that's how it was the entire time. They wrote off Queenie for like 90% of the show. None of the other witches in the Coven were particularly close to her or even nice to her or thought her power was special.
If nothing else, like they attempt to do what is essentially like colorblind casting, like similar to like Shondaland, and that like it doesn't always hit. Like y'all, like if I were to look at their cast blindly and not know what characters they were playing, I'd be like, that is a very diverse cast. Like and the issue is the execution.
They cast very diversely, and I really appreciate that they have casted disabled characters to play disabled characters, or like even on the season that has Angelica, I can't remember her last name. She's on the one with Emma Roberts where they're in the camp setting. And I really appreciate that they didn't make transness the center of her story the same way that I appreciate they didn't make Queenie's being centered around her like being heavier black woman or anything like that. That wasn't the center of it. I appreciate those things. However, the execution is the problem. They put the characters in place and then they don't necessarily think of how things can go wrong when you don't address the elephant in the room sometimes. That wasn't a problem in 1984. That didn't fucking matter. But in this season, it was a problem.
I think that's why the seasons that work the best are the ones that sort of have these blank slate contexts, right? Like slavery in New Orleans and the history of magic in New Orleans is not a blank slate. But something like a haunted house is a blank slate. Like a spooky camp is a blank slate. So that kind of casting only works in those types of seasons. Whereas like the seasons that have cultural context beyond, like even a hotel is like, it's like pretty neutral territory. Whereas like the circus and a freak show is not. There's a lot of history behind those types of things. Even like an asylum or like religious institutions or like the church. I really do like Asylum. I think it's a very scary season, but they do like incorporate like Nazism and like things that have cultural context existent beyond just like the four walls of that story. So I think that like I really do like American Horror Story like as a show. I'm a big fan and I've like seen every season and I find it like endlessly fascinating. I think because it is so informed by the horror genre, I like to see what they do with things. But like I would sit back and say like the seasons that are the best are the ones that sort of like exist in their own isolated world and don't try to do too much as far as like having outside societal conversations contributing to the script or to the story.
Yeah, I think the season is still like a strong season and it's enjoyable to watch, but they certainly did have issues with stuff that was like just an elephant in the room that they weren't addressing. Like, why were only certain witches ever considered as a potential supreme, which was mainly just Misty and Madison were like the only contenders who were really considered. So much so that her own daughter was written off because she was like too weak. And then also her anger towards Cordelia when Cordelia goes and gets her husband's baby gravy and is trying to have a baby and she goes to the Voodoo to fix that, and then her character's like very angry at her for even trying to use voodoo to get pregnant.
That was super interesting scene. She was like, you make us look weak if you go to ask for them for help, that they think we can't solve a simple fertility problem.
But she couldn't because her daughter couldn't get pregnant. And she uses magic so much for her own vanity and for her own benefit that it was bizarre that she would be angry at her for something like that. So it was an indication that she did look down or felt competitive with, I was about to say, should I say voodoo witches or voodoo practitioners? I don't know.
They call them the Black Witches.
Well, that's the other thing. It's so racialized in their own language that it's crazy that we're not viewing this feud as racially motivated to begin with.
Especially when we know that they've been alive for so long. So it's a hard sell to me that they're saying that there's no part of Fiona that's racist, but she's been alive for hundreds of years.
Unless it's trying to be like a commentary on white liberalism, but I don't think it was. I don't think it was that self-aware.
I don't think so. Yeah. I don't really have a beef with Ryan Murphy or Brad Falchuk, so, but like they're both white dudes who live in like California, so I don't think they that self-aware to know about like white liberal issues with race. And
I honestly could do a whole podcast on Ryan Murphy.
We've said it before, like I think you said it, Zeba, the Ryan Murphy gaze is like its own gaze, and it's very violently homosexual, and I mean that literally. Like, it's not like aggressively homosexual. I mean, it's violent against homosexuals.
He has an infinite supply of attractive men with brown hair and blue eyes. Like, he just keeps them locked away in an attic and they just come out.
And I will say he is loyal to his actors. Like, once he decides that you're one of his, he will recast you over and over and over and over and over again. And I love who his favorites are, too. I respect his picks. Even if it's, like, an actor who I know to be, like, interpersonally not a good person, I still love the way he casts them. Like, I think he is a really good, like, a developer of a cast. And I like that he's, like, consistently goes back to the actors of color and like the actors with disabilities and like difference of age ranges as well that he casts, that like he returns to those people. I appreciate.
He really showed the world how great of an actress Sarah Paulson was, because she kind of got overlooked a lot. The same way that like Christina Ricci, when she was doing press for Yellow Jackets, was saying she found her home in horror because mainstream Hollywood really cast her and stuff because they didn't find her leading lady pretty enough, quote unquote. And I feel like it was similarly with Sarah Paulson, even though I think both her and Christina Ricci are absolutely gorgeous and I would watch anything they were in. There is like this perception of who gets to be a leading lady and who gets to be the sidekick, and you have to find your genre. And through American Horror Story, Sarah Paulson was able to really showcase her talent by playing so many different roles. And I think he's done a really good job about letting people showcase their talent.
It's separate kind of from the voodoo point, but I want to talk about bit more about the vagina dentata and the mon femme that is Zoe. Because if we cast our memories back to Teeth, when we were talking about vagina dentatas and Barbara Creed's take, she is talking about like the history of it, and she says that according to Freud, like a lot of the vagina dentata lore came to be like associated with virgins, like this idea of like mystery, like it might be a revenge thing, like vengeance for her defloration. And I just thought that was basically the first time induces penis envy, or virginity heightens the fear of castration anxiety. I thought that was interesting because obviously your character is a virgin when it first happens, so it's kind of like going in with that Freudian perception of it. And then to quote Creed, she says that the vagina dentata is particularly relevant to the iconography of the horror film, which abounds images that play on the fear of castration and dismemberment. And it can be understood in two different ways. Castration can refer to symbolic castration, like loss of the mother's body or identity or something, or it can be literal genital castration. And I thought that was interesting when you consider Kyle and why Kyle isn't like affected by Zoe, and they kind of just vaguely use the argument that he's already dead. But I think if you're viewing like castration as like dismemberment, he was already dismembered, so he's like debatably already been castrated in that way, like literally. I mean, his penis isn't even his real penis when they make a joke about it, that they took the best parts from each of the boys. And then he's also already been castrated like symbolically by his mother, being the fact that she assaulted him, and she represents that kind of monstrous mother figure, like that pre-eatable mother who threatens to engulf the infant, like basically reabsorbing the infant into the womb and like devouring them. You lose your identity, you all become one, because she had like this pedophilic obsession.
I had completely forgot that happened in that show until you just said that, and now
it's another side plot with like bizarre sexual like aggression. It's very mon femme, I'll give it that.
They actually have quite a few seasons where there's a weird mother-son relationship, because there was also a weird one with like Dandy on the Carnival season as well.
But I do feel like all those like themes that show up in multiple seasons are references to like Psycho and all the films that have referenced Psycho.
They do, yeah, I agree. They definitely do a great job at like incorporating horror tropes and references. With her case, It felt different than the way that we've seen Vagina and Todd in the past because it wasn't acts of revenge. Like the first time that she ended up killing someone, she was losing her virginity, but it was to her boyfriend and it wasn't assault at all. It was...
Yeah, but then she does kill the other surviving rapist that raped Madison who survived the car crash. She goes and kills him. So she becomes it later, a rape revenge.
I feel like I wouldn't want that as a power. Even to have to do that as revenge, which is, I would be like, I would not be feeling it.
It is a curse. I mean, we covered that in Teeth, but it is a curse.
Thank you for listening to The Monstrous Feminine. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at The MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and follow us on TikTok at The Monstrous Feminine Pod. Brooms up, witches out.